The bullet hit the drum before anyone heard the shot. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. The explosion came first, a rolling column of black and orange that swallowed the eastern ridgeline whole. And only after the echo reached them did anyone think to look for where the round had come from. 3 kilometers of open desert between the muzzle and the target. 3 kilometers of heat shimmer and crosswind and elevation change that most trained snipers would have called impossible without a spotter, without a second attempt, without anything except the right person behind the glass. Sergeant Lydia Horne had been on the team for 11 days. Nobody had asked her opinion about anything yet. The assignment came through on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that only matters later. Lieutenant Colonel Dara got the transfer paperwork at 0600 and didn't brief the team until 1400, which told you something about how excited he was. The unit was Delta attached, 4 men who'd been working together for 16 months in the same theater, the same dirt, the same pattern of sun and shadow and waiting. They had their rhythms, they had their shorthand, they had the particular kind of closed system that forms when people survive things together, and they weren't looking to add anyone to it, especially not someone they'd never heard of. Sergeant First Class Pollard read the transfer sheet twice, then set it down on the hood of the vehicle and looked at his team lead, Staff Sergeant Romig, with the specific expression of a man who had decided not to say what he was thinking. Romig said it anyway. Who cleared her for Delta support? Dara didn't answer that directly. He talked about the mission profile instead, a hostage situation developing fast in the Valley Corridor, a compound that had too many angles for a small team to cover cleanly, the need for an elevated position on the Western Shelf that would require someone who could hold still for 6 hours and then perform when it counted. He talked about her qualification scores without saying what they were. He talked about her experience in a theater she'd never served in before. He did not talk about the fact that Pollard and Romig and the others were already running the numbers in their heads and coming up with the same answer. They were being handed a problem. Horne arrived at the forward position at 1730. She drove herself in, which was unusual. She came in a vehicle that was older than most of the equipment in the FOB, and she parked it crooked, which Pollard noticed. She was 29 years old and looked younger in the way that some people do when they haven't been broken down by the particular kind of grinding that extended deployment puts into your face. She carried a rifle case that was longer than regulation, which also didn't go unremarked. "What is that?" said Corporal Ferris. "It wasn't really a question. Macmillan TAC 338, Horne said. Modified? Modified how? Modified the way I needed it to be." Ferris looked at Romig. Romig looked at the rifle case. Nobody said anything for a moment. "You qualified on a .338? Pollard said. "I qualified on everything they put in front of me," Horne said. "The .338 I asked for." That was the whole conversation. Horne found a spare corner of the workspace, put her gear down in a way that suggested she'd had a lot of practice making do with limited space, and started running her own checks without asking for anything or anyone. Pollard watched her for about 30 seconds, then turned back to the table where the mission maps were spread. "Darag's setting us up," Romig said quietly. "Could be. A woman with a hunting rifle she modified herself. It's not a hunting rifle. It came in a case the size of a hunting rifle." Pollard looked at the maps. "We'll see." What he meant was that they would see her fail, and that he would not enjoy it, but that it was better to know now than later. That was the honest version of his thinking. Though he wouldn't have said it out loud, because he was not the kind of man who said things like that out loud. He was the kind of man who thought them, and then waited, and then adjusted, when the evidence required adjusting. The evidence had not required adjusting yet. The briefing that night covered the Valley Corridor and the compound and the 9 hostages and the timing window they'd been given, which was narrow. The compound sat in a depression between 2 ridgelines, which created a coverage problem that the team had been trying to solve since the situation developed 3 days earlier. The eastern approach was mined. The southern wall had a blind angle that couldn't be covered from ground level. The northern entry point was viable, but would require suppression on the western shelf, which was 700 meters from the wire, at its closest point, and closer to a kilometer from the positions that mattered. Horne had been quiet through most of the briefing. She stood slightly apart from the rest of them, not because she was trying to signal something, but because the table was crowded and she'd arrived last and hadn't wanted to push herself into the center of it. She was listening. She had a habit, Pollard noticed, of looking at a map the way some people look at a clock, absorbing information on a rhythm that wasn't obvious from the outside. Western Shelf, she said. Everyone looked at her. There's a secondary position, she said, and put her finger on a point that was significantly further from the compound than the one they'd been discussing. I can work from here. That's 1,100 meters to the near wire, Romig said. 1,400 to the positions that matter, so you can't cover them. Horne looked at him for a moment. I can cover them. From 1,400 meters with a .338. The round is capable of that range. The question isn't the round. Nobody filled the silence that followed. Horne looked back at the map. There's a fuel depot on the eastern side of the compound, she said. Partially sheltered by the building, but exposed from the secondary position. If the extraction goes wrong and they need to move the hostages through the eastern passage, there's no way to suppress that side from the primary shelf without hitting the buildings. From the secondary position, I can reach the depot directly. A hit on the depot creates secondary ignition that clears the passage. If it hits, Romig said. When it hits, Horne said. Pollard looked at her for a long moment. He had learned over the years to read something in people that wasn't confidence exactly, but that lived in the same neighborhood. Some people talked about what they could do because they needed to convince themselves. Some people talked about it because they'd already done it in their heads, and the conversation was just catching up to the calculation they'd already run. Horne looked like the second type. That didn't mean she was right. That meant she thought she was, and that was a different thing. You'd be outside support range, Pollard said. Yes, if something goes wrong on that shelf, we can't reach you. I know, you'd be alone out there for the better part of 6 hours before the window opens. Horne looked at him. I've been alone longer. She didn't elaborate. She went back to studying the map, and after a moment, Pollard looked at Romig, who gave him the smallest possible shrug, which was Romig's version of, I don't know either. They didn't give her the secondary position that night. They gave her the primary shelf and the standard parameters and a communication window that assumed she would not be shooting past 800 meters. Horne didn't argue. She wrote down the assignments and folded the paper and put it in her pocket. Pollard saw her very briefly look at the map one more time before they left the briefing room. She looked at the secondary position. Then she looked away. The team moved out at 0300. Horne separated at the base of the western approach and climbed alone in the dark, which she had said she preferred because it meant she wasn't adjusting her pace for anyone else. Pollard watched her go until the darkness absorbed her, which took about 40 seconds. The shelf was rough terrain, loose shale overlying sandstone, the kind of surface that made noise if you didn't know it and silence if you did. The comms check at 0415 came back clean. Horne's voice was steady in a way that wasn't performed. Some people get steady when they're nervous. Others get quiet. She sounded the way a person sounds when they have already made peace with waiting. The window opened at 0900. The first 4 minutes of the extraction went cleanly. Romig's element hit the northern entry, drew the expected response, and created the corridor that Pollard's element needed to bring the hostages through the center passage. It was working. It was working the way it was supposed to work, which was not how it usually went, and that was the detail that should have told them something. The problem came from the eastern side. There were 2 additional assets in the compound that hadn't been on the intelligence, men positioned in the structure, adjacent to the fuel depot, covering the eastern passage that nobody was supposed to be using, but that the hostages were now going to have to use, because the center passage had taken fire from an angle that the map hadn't shown. Romig called it over comms, and there was a fraction of a second where every option was evaluated and rejected, and then he called Horne's position. We need the depot, he said. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. I'm not on the depot, Horne said. I'm on the secondary shelf. Silence. Pollard understood it in the same instant that Romig did. She had moved in the dark, alone, without telling them. She had climbed to the position she had argued for and been denied, because she had known, in the way she knew things, that it was the only position from which the mission could be saved if it went wrong in the way she had predicted it would go wrong. Distance? Pollard said. 3,100 meters to the depot. Wind is shifting. I need 40 seconds. Hostages are moving in 30. Tell them to wait. Romig told them to wait. Ferris, who was with the hostage group, transmitted back something that wasn't a word, which was fair because 30 seconds felt like nothing until you were the one standing in a passage with no cover and armed men on your left. The 40 seconds passed. The shot that came afterward was heard by no one in the compound. What they heard was the explosion, the secondary ignition that moved through the depot in a chain that took less than 2 seconds from initial impact to the point where the eastern passage was clear and the threat on that side of the compound had ceased to exist. Hostages moved through, Ferris moved through, Romig's element consolidated on the extraction point. Pollard stood in the compound and looked at the eastern ridgeline, 3 kilometers away, where Horne was already breaking down her position. He stood there for longer than he needed to. The debrief happened at 1600, and it was not comfortable for anyone. Colonel Vassy ran it, not Dara, which was already a signal. Vassy was the kind of officer who asked questions in a specific order that was designed to arrive somewhere, and the order she chose made clear that she already knew where she was going. She let Pollard finish his account of the eastern complication. Then she asked Horne to explain the decision to deviate from the assigned position. Horne explained it once, clearly, without hedging. She had assessed the secondary position as the only viable solution to a coverage gap she'd identified during the briefing. She had not been authorized to use that position. She had used it anyway. She understood that this created a problem. Vassy asked if she would make the same decision again. Horne said yes. Romig made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The part that Pollard thought about afterward was not the shot, though the shot was extraordinary by any reasonable metric. A 300-meter hit on a stationary target in shifting crosswind with a self-modified rifle, unsupported, after 6 hours of stillness on exposed terrain. The people who ran the numbers the next day did so quietly because they were the kind of numbers that made other things seem less impressive by comparison, and there is a specific discomfort that comes with that. What Pollard had thought about was the 40 seconds. She had said 40 seconds and she had meant exactly 40 seconds. Not approximately, not roughly. She had run the calculation so many times on that shelf, in the dark, over 6 hours of waiting, that when the moment came, the number was already exact. She had known the wind pattern would shift at that hour because she had been watching it shift for hours before and had learned its rhythm. She had known the secondary ignition would clear the passage because she had studied the depot's configuration from satellite imagery 2 days earlier and had mapped the likely blast radius in her head without being asked to. She had done all of this without telling anyone, not because she was hiding it, but because nobody had asked, and she had already learned in 11 days that asking required a kind of energy she didn't have to spare. That was the detail Pollard couldn't let go of, not the capability, the calculation behind the capability. The way she had been doing all of this parallel work, while everyone around her was running their own assessment, which had concluded incorrectly that she was a liability. He thought about what that cost a person over time. There were 9 hostages. All 9 came out. 2 had injuries sustained before the team arrived, non-life-threatening. 1 child, 7 years old, who had been in the compound for 72 hours, and who, when Ferris carried him to the extraction vehicle, had asked for water and then fallen asleep in the time it took to find a bottle. Ferris told that story at the FOB that evening and didn't mention Horne's name once, which was an accident rather than a slap, but which told you something about how things get credited in the immediate aftermath of an operation before anyone has had time to think clearly. Horne ate alone at the far end of the mess table and didn't seem to mind or not mind. She was cleaning a part of the rifle, which was what she did when she needed to do something with her hands. Pollard sat down across from her without being invited, which was unusual for him. She looked up. The secondary position, he said. Yes. How long had you planned to move there? She set down the part she'd been cleaning. Since the briefing. You knew the center passage would take fire. I thought it was likely. The angle on the third guard position was wrong. The intelligence had him static, but a person in that position for more than 4 hours moves. If he moved to his natural rest position, he'd have a line on the center corridor that no one had accounted for. You didn't say that. Horne looked at him. There was something in the look that was not accusatory and not resigned. It was more like a person presenting a simple fact about the world that they have long since stopped being surprised by. Would it have changed anything? She said. Pollard didn't answer. I need to finish the rifle, she said. He left her to it. He went back to the other end of the table and sat down next to Romig, who was eating and not looking at anything in particular. She called the center passage, Pollard said quietly. Romig stopped eating. When? At the briefing. Didn't say it. Romig was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his food. Why didn't she say it? He said. Pollard looked across the mess at Horne, who had gone back to her rifle. Because she knew what would happen if she did, he said. What happened next came from outside the team. A defense intelligence officer named Carver had been running a parallel track on the Valley Corridor operation for reasons that didn't fully become clear until later. Carver had the kind of authority that didn't need to introduce itself, and he arrived at the FOB 2 days after the extractions with paperwork that asked, in very polite institutional language, for Horne to be reassigned out of the theater pending a review of the secondary position deviation. The deviation, the paperwork said, had created an unsupported element in a high-risk zone. It had jeopardized the mission integrity. It was, in the specific language used, not in keeping with operational discipline standards. 9 hostages all out. Pollard read the paperwork twice. Then he went to Darrag's office and closed the door, which he had done approximately twice in 16 months. He said things he usually didn't say. He said them carefully and specifically. He laid out the timeline of the Eastern complication and the coverage gap and the 40 seconds and the calculation that had been running in Horne's head for 6 hours on a shelf that no one else had been willing to climb. He said that if Horne had stayed on the primary shelf as authorized, the extraction fails. 2 of the 3 Eastern positions were outside effective range of the primary shelf. Ferris's element gets compromised. The hostages don't make it through the passage. He said that if they were going to have a conversation about operational discipline, they should have it with someone who had the actual record in front of them, not a sanitized version. Darragh listened. He was not a man who changed his position quickly, but he was a man who changed it when the argument required it. He made a call. Carver's paperwork was declined. The review was shelved. Horne stayed in theater. Pollard didn't tell her any of this directly. He told Romig to pass along that the transfer was off the table. Romig went to do that and came back without reporting what she'd said, which he had specifically not asked him to report, because some things don't need to be delivered back. What Romig said instead was, she already knew. 3 weeks later, Pollard was coordinating a support request from a different element working a difficult extraction in a confined urban space. He needed an elevated position covered, a clean line on 2 buildings that were giving the element trouble, and a window that was going to open and close in a period of about 90 seconds. He could have called in multiple options. He called Horne. She was on the position before he finished explaining the requirements, which was not how it was supposed to work, but which was, by then, exactly how it worked. He had learned to describe the problem to her and stop before he started describing the solution, because her solution was usually different from his and usually better. And it was more useful to let her arrive at it cleanly than to spend 15 minutes reverse engineering. From a starting point that had been wrong, the urban extraction cleared, no casualties, window closed exactly as it had been timed to close. Afterward, Ferris said something to Horne that Pollard didn't fully hear. He heard the end of it, which was something about the shot she'd made in the urban space being cleaner than anything he'd seen from a support asset in this theater. He heard Horne respond, which was unusual, because she didn't usually respond to that kind of thing. She said, "My father hunted. He taught me that you don't shoot at the animal. You shoot at the place where the animal is going to be. The bullet and the target arrive at the same moment." Ferris looked like he was working out whether this applied to what she'd just done. "You had that timed," he said. "You have to," she said. "You always have to." Pollard heard it from 10 feet away, and he wrote nothing down and said nothing at the time. He stored it the way he stored things that mattered, in the part of his mind that didn't let go of things easily, next to the memory of an explosion on an eastern ridgeline that had arrived before the sound of the shot, next to a 40-second calculation run in 6 hours of darkness, next to 9 people, walking through a passage that should have been impossible. The team had a rhythm now. It was different from the rhythm before Horne arrived, which was not something any of them had said out loud. But the evidence was in the work, and Pollard was a man who believed in evidence. He had adjusted when the evidence required adjusting. It had taken him 11 days to start, and he thought about that sometimes. He thought about what she had already known and hadn't said, and what she had already calculated and hadn't shared, and what she had climbed in the dark to be ready for. Alone, unsupported, without being asked. He thought about the version of this that happens when there's no one to go to Darrag's office. He thought about that longer than was comfortable, and he thought it was supposed to be uncomfortable, and he didn't look away from it. That was the thing about Sergeant First Class Lydia Horne that took the longest to understand. It wasn't the shot. Anyone who ran the numbers could understand the shot. It was the discipline required to hold everything she knew quietly for 11 days, to climb a shelf she hadn't been authorized to climb, to give the team 40 seconds when she had been given 30, and to trust that the numbers she had run alone in the dark were more reliable than everyone else's certainty that they were wrong. They were. They always had been. The team just needed time to catch up.